Hello and welcome everyone to our Innovation Lunch and Learn, where you'll be hearing about how you can use open innovation to deliver better, cheaper and quicker. So we very much hope that you enjoyed today's session as we delve into the world of innovation with Rikesh Shah, who is formerly the Head of Innovation at Transport for London. And Rikesh will share with us today the approaches adopted by TfL to foster innovation, to deliver better services, cheaper and quicker, whilst drawing inspiration from the private sector and academia. In terms of format, as always, we'll have the presentation first, and then we'll take questions at the end. If questions do occur during the presentation, then please put those in the chat. But without further ado, I will now hand over to Rikesh, who will share his slides.
Kenta, thank you. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So what I will do is, as Kenta mentioned, I'll share my slides, but I can't see anyone because of the format of my system. So just shout, if anyone's got a pressing question, just shout. Otherwise, we'll pick them up at 12:30. But it's lovely to be here, and let me just get my screen. Okay, I'm hoping you can see that. Kenta, can you see that?
Yes, I can see that. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, look, good afternoon, everyone. So, as Genta mentioned, I'll touch on the concept of how can innovation in cities work, or what are some of, at least what are some of the challenges and what are some of the recommendations for it to work. A little bit about me. As Genta mentioned, I was at Transport for London for quite some time. I was there for 22 years, and most recently as the head of open innovation. I also led the open data program and a series of other things. And we saw some incredible challenges during my time there. You know, I was lucky to be involved with things like the Olympic Games. So some of the challenges around TfL growing from a very small organization into a 30,000 person organization, to new services like the Elizabeth line. So I've seen lots of different things that I was directly or indirectly involved with when I was there. I'm currently doing a part-time role at the Connected Places Catapult, and it's primarily around how do we use procurement to drive more innovation into the public sector. It's one for another day, but in short, the public sector spends around £300 billion a year on procurement. And of course, lots of millions on internal resources, billions on internal resources. But what we want to do is how do we drive more innovation value through that procurement spend? We all recognize that the challenges in the public sector, particularly local authorities, are significant. We've got challenges around social care, children's services, and many other areas. We've got such as challenges with the sustainability agenda, climate change, crime, and much more. So with advances in technology, how can we do more? I also do some freelance work through Innovate Today, which is a consultancy that I've set up, which I do on my non-part-time hour days at the Catapult. I was on the Smart London board, which was an absolute delight with working with Lottie colleagues in particular. I'm also a non-exec director at the London Transport Museum. So if you do happen to be in the Covent Garden area, it has some fantastic gifts. So please do pop in and spend some of those pennies. And then I also do some lecturing. I lecture at the University of Oxford, Harvard University, the Royal College of Arts, and various others. So it's quite a wide-ranging sort of portfolio career, which I'm enjoying. So in the context of transport, these are logos of cities across the world, and it's their transport agencies. So the first point is, for innovation to work at scale, there needs to be a system approach. So whether you're a local authority or a central government agency, applying innovation locally is fine, but there always needs to be a consideration of, if it works in one context, can it work in 10, 15, 20, or if not 1,000? Because ultimately, to realize the value, you need to be able to scale the innovation. And that means that bringing different parts of the organization together, different leaders together, and potentially even politicians together who may not always agree because of the badge that they're wearing. In terms of Transport for London, it's responsible for 31 million trips across London. You'll all be familiar with it. They'll be going through your boroughs, whether it's the road network, the bus network, or the tube network. But in terms of transport more broadly, across the world, when you have an integrated transport agency, four main things are the responsibility of the integrated agency. So number one is quite often they run a service end to end. So if we think about the tube network, there are about 14,000 people running the tube network every day in London. And that includes anyone from customer facing staff on the front line to the train drivers or the tube drivers to also many of the engineers. So completely when it comes to innovation, it's owned by those 14,000 people. Of course, there's a supply chain that supports them in some aspects, but there's an end-to-end service that's being run. The second area is the procurement side. So when you look at the buses in London, there are probably about 15 bus operators, or the Docklands Light Railway, or the London Overground Service. So the bus network itself is worth about £1.5 to £2 billion a year in terms of contracting. So the public sector is a significant buyer, and many of you are significant buyers. So how do you use that buying power to shape markets and to bring more innovation in? That's something we'll come on to later in this presentation. The third area is the influencing agenda. City leaders, city agencies, they have significant influence, whether it's areas like road safety, active travel, and other key policy areas, so, such as freight. In freight, more often than not, you might not be a buyer of a service. You may not even change much in terms of policy, but you certainly have significant influence. And then the fourth area, which is a relatively emerging area, is cities like Hong Kong now, which are probably more mature than London, are starting to bring new revenues in. And that's being reinvested back into public service. And in the case of transport, back into the transport services. So in London, TfL has the largest out-of-home advertising contract in Europe. It's also a significant landowner, like many of you are. It's how do you repurpose that land and generate new revenue? And by generating that revenue, you will then reinvest that back into public service without actually selling the asset itself, but perhaps doing things on that asset. That means that you'll not only keep the capital, but you also create new operational revenue. So that's broadly the role of transport services in the cities. Ultimately, they're to make people's lives better. Ultimately, they're there to keep the economic agenda of the city, fulfilled. And it's also about making sure people feel safe and secure as they move around the city. But as we know, it's not straightforward. In the context of London, we have 32 boroughs, as you very much know. And then you have organizations like TfL, the health services, and other central functions that are going across. So how do you make it work, and how do you enable a one system approach to lots of different ideas? The supply chain is also complex. An organization like TfL, local borough, will have hundreds of suppliers. How do you make sure you future-proof? How do you make sure you're engaged? How do you make sure different suppliers are talking to each other? Because without doing all of that, innovation can't really come through. Trade unions, there are lots of positives about them, but when you work in a trade union environment, you've got to make sure you engage with them early. They're incredibly powerful, particularly in transport. So you've got to be transparent, be open, engage early, and then work with them and perhaps pivot if you're trying to bring something innovative in. So that does take time. And then, as we know, politics is short term. So if you're thinking about something in the long run, you might get new mayors, new councillors, and they may drive the agenda in a different direction. So how do you have an innovation lens that's working with the right trajectory, but you factor in potential different decision makers who might want to take it in a different direction? So how do you manage that? There is a commonality between what cities want. Is when you ask cities what they want, sustainability is front of mind, and whether that's London, Manchester, Oman, the EU, or the US. And that notion of healthier streets is critical. We're seeing 10,000 people dying as a result of respiratory diseases in London, or in Europe, we saw 22,000 fatalities as a result of road safety over the last year. So it's a significant number. And in places like India, you're seeing even more. Unofficially, it's about 200,000 deaths a year. So a healthier city is fundamental, whether it's the air that you're breathing in, whether it's road safety, or whether it's even people being more active. how can you get people to walk and cycle more? The second area is, if you want people to do that, you need to make sure you provide the right alternative. So whether it's cycle lanes, whether it's better buses, whether it's better tube services, or the Elizabeth line connecting East and West London, you have to provide the right alternative. And in London, the target that's been set, which many of you will be familiar with, is 80% of trips to be made by walking, cycling, and public transport by 2041. It's around 63% at the moment, but this is the driver that many cities are thinking about. And then finally, if you want that to work, you need to make sure that you're providing people with value for money. And I'll come on to that in a second. Innovation's not new. Whether you're in a borough or whether you're at TfL or anyone else, it's not new. Innovation is about how do you do things better, cheaper, quicker, and ultimately it's about problem solving and experimenting and then coming up with the right solutions. So there are two very distinct problems on the screen at the moment. In 1863, Charles Pearson, or it's around the 1840s, Charles Pearson came with the brainchild of a brainwave of we've got challenges above ground where the horse and cart is getting in the way of each other, which is having a productivity impact. So he thought about what can we do below ground. So those tunnels that you see across London and now across the world was sort of the brainwave of Charles Pearson. And we've seen how the metro has had a significant impact and continues to have a significant impact in cities across the world. And on the right hand side, you've got the first traffic light. We've got 6,500 traffic signals now in London, but it started with a flammable traffic light, which was trying to smooth traffic flow outside the Houses of Parliament. And with both of these, when you're experimenting, it does mean it would fail. And there were some failures. You know, many people sadly and tragically died, whether you're digging the tunnels or whether you're using the flammable traffic signal. So failure does happen, but it's about learning and putting the right safeguards in place, or the guardrails in place for innovation to thrive. To the modern day, I was fortunate to be managing the open data program. So at its peak, we had 17,000 developers registered to access TfL's data. It was genuinely in its time world class, where we had API plugins and cloud in 2014, when cloud was still relatively new as a concept. And what we realized is every pound we invested in open data, we got 130 back. So the ROI was significant, and it really has been a game changer when it comes to customer information for people moving around cities. But it's not just that. Contactless is completely, contactless is completely changing things across the world. Where the merchant bankers are saying to us, or the merchants are saying, if it wasn't for transport, contactless take-up wouldn't have been as significant as it has been. So that's a driver of change, moving people from cash to cashless. The first hydrogen train in Germany is completely changing how train travel may happen in the future. EVs, the challenges around infrastructure, particularly if you're in an apartment block, is how do we deal with that challenge? And on the bottom right, you've got Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth opening the Elizabeth line. But some of the civil engineering innovation is incredible. You know, you've got 2 or 3 inches between tunnels on the TfL estate, and imagine how heavy those tunnels are, and the level of civil engineering sort of brilliance that you need. And so innovation doesn't always have to be a whizzy tech product. It could be infrastructure, it could be civil engineering, it could be a process, it could be a people thing. Moving forward, we shouldn't do anything, in my view, unless it benefits our own citizens or our customers. And we used to call these this entity users, passengers, but actually the right term is customers. And what customers want in London is 3 things. Number 1, get the basics right. Make sure every journey is reliable, it's safe, it's secure, because that's what people want when they get onto any form of tube service, metro service, and that's anywhere in the world, whether it's Dubai, New York, or London. The second point is they want value for money. If you're providing the right alternative, they want to make sure they're getting value for money, because if they're not and the car is cheaper, why should they change? Because people quite like their own car. You know, it's independent, they can listen to the music. Sometimes they say actually sitting in traffic is a good trade-off. So how do you incentivize them to use more sustainable forms of transport? And finally, If you're getting that right, then you get the license to operate when it comes to being progressive and innovative. But if you do it the wrong way around, it's really hard to get that citizen buy-in. And cities now are spending a lot of money and time on customer research, customer engagement, and trying to bring customers as part of the solution. And that's where that notion of design thinking comes in. So next slide is there's a hypothesis. And that hypothesis is when it comes to innovation, we should do everything ourselves. I'm the head of tech, I'm the head of engineering, I have a monopoly on innovation. That's a fair school of thought, and 80–90% of the time they're probably right, but 10% of the time they might be wrong. But then when they're wrong, sometimes they then go to the market and overprescribe what they want. So they will define the solution rather than defining the problem. And when you define the solution, it might be right, but if it's wrong, 5 years later, someone will say, we should have done this differently, but we've spent a few £1 million now, so let's carry on. And the point here is that the market is changing. You know, from when I started at TFO in 2001, you probably had a bunch of tier 1 suppliers that were doing a lot of the R&D for TFL. And they were in some really big, cool building with lots of scientists and R&D experts, blacked out windows. And every so often they'd come back to TFO and say, do you want to buy this? Or what do you think of this? But the point now is the innovation could come from academic institutes who have spin outs. They could come from startups. They could come from scale ups. They could come from accelerators. They could come from venture capitalists. They could also come from corporates with R&D labs. So my view is, how do you use your city, your borough as a test bed to stimulate more innovation? Because I assure you, the innovators would rather do it together with you rather than doing it independently and spending a whole lot of R&D money that might be wasted. But it's ultimately about driving better, cheaper, quicker outcomes. I never ever cared about cool things or whizzy things. It was never about a thought leadership piece on us being inventors. It was always about creating new value, and that value, you know, can it come from the market? Because if you think about closed innovation, which is where you're doing things internally, there's a massive setup cost, and then the return could be significant if it succeeds. But with open innovation, your cost of development significantly is reduced. But not only does it create new value in terms of you as a buyer, but it could also create new revenue opportunities, because the market, frankly, in my view, is better than the public sector when it comes to creating new revenue lines, because that's what they do. So they could sell what they've developed with you and sell it to other cities or councils across the UK, or more importantly, across the world. But there are challenges when it comes to innovation, and these may resonate with some of you. Culture, you know, you may want to bring something innovative in, but someone says it's too risky. The press won't like it. The stakeholders won't like it. Or your colleagues might say, you know, it's not my idea, so it's not a good idea. So how do we address that? How do we get better at defining problems and not focus on solutions? Far too often I sit with city leaders across the world and they'll spend time on the solutions. And I have to take them back to say, hold on, can we just spend another hour or two discussing the problem to make sure that we've got the context right, we've got the problem right, and we've got the right stakeholders around the table, and we've got that customer feedback, rather than me with my biases saying, that's the idea, let's just go with that. If you want to work with the market, you've got to create a very clear shop window. Procurement, I'll come on to in a second, but we get worried about talking to the market. You know, someone in procurement says, well, you can't have a conversation with that organization because you might distort the market. It's not about distorting the market, it's about understanding what is in the market and then decide what your procurement strategy is. So I think really think about who's out there, search far, search wide, and you could really bring some incredible innovation in that creates value. Think about procurement routes up front. Quite often people do the R&D and then they go to procurement. Bring your procurement colleagues in early. It's worth the investment of 3 to 6 weeks rather than having to pause and go back to the market again, which simply annoys the people you do the R&D with. Also, governance is important. And finally, don't let perfection sort of be the problem. If you get things 80% there, pivot, iterate, test, and trial further. Don't try and get to 100% during the that first R&D stage. If you think there's something there based on evidence, let your gut take over and say, how would I do it if this was my own business? because sometimes we do worry about, as I say, that the politicians and the media, of course, you have to respect them, but there's a narrative to be played to get the buying. And there are multiple opportunities, and I've touched on some of these already. But the one that I would really encourage is around rapid prototyping, testing, working with operations. Be as lean as you can, be as agile as you can, and try and create that momentum and enthusiasm that don't worry if we get it wrong, but we're in this together. Let's take our badges off. Here's how we approached it at TfL. We engage with the market far and wide. And this is both whether you're being disrupted through new mobility in the case of TfL, or whether you're looking for a new product to create more better value. And I think when you do that engagement, don't simply say yes to everything, nor do you say no to everything, in my view. If you think there's something there, assess whether it's useful, why is it useful, how can it be applied in your context, put some criteria around it. You know, does it support your air quality agenda? Will there be data sharing? Is it safe? Is it secure? How does it align to your strategic goals? And if that works, well, then start thinking about delivery. And that delivery could be procurement, it could be policy, or it could be another route to scale. So that's how I would approach it. Put some sort of process in place. Don't fall for the hype. You will always get suppliers coming to you from across the world that will say they can solve everything. Whether it's the latest cloud, or whether it's Gen AI, or whether it's quantum computing or robotics. Be the intelligent client, understand how new technologies works. And that doesn't have to just be tech-based technologies. That could be new materials, if you're building new road infrastructure. It could be new types of building materials. It could be anything. So think of the innovation as any form of concept. But try and be the intelligent client working with your service owner, and then move forward, because otherwise the market could have one over on you, which is they'll give you lots of hype and expect you to buy it, and you might only use 50% of what they've sold to you. I'm a big fan of the innovation funnel. This is something I encourage cities across the world to think about. Is on the left-hand side, start with your problem statements. Search wide across the business and define what the right conditions are for success. You know, have you got an interested, enthusiastic service owner? Have you got budgets lined up downstream? Have you got the right procurement people on side? Have you got the right parts of the organization on side? And fundamentally, do you think innovation can add value? And if you think it can, well, then from 100 filter down to 30. Start turning them, or even from 3 to filter down to 1, and turn that into an innovation brief. Go out to the market, scout far, scout wide, create a test bed, and like test bed experiment. Some of the experiments I've run, they lasted a day. Some have lasted 2 years. So don't be afraid to extend or close, and then iterate. And once you build your evidence, then think about your scaling strategy. But your scaling strategy should always be considered up front. That's much more around scaling the implementing the scale. And then hopefully you create new value. And by creating that new value, if you've tried 10 things, 8 of them have failed, but 2 of them have really succeeded, and that's paid back everything and more that you've invested in innovation. This was about taking your badges off. It comes back to my earlier point. You will have so many influences across your organization, and 1 or 2 may be naysayers, and they're saying it just won't work. Let's stick with the status quo. So how do you get them to take their badges off at the beginning? How do you engage with them and say, do we all agree that we've got a problem here that we're stuck on as a borough? And as we're stuck on it, do we all agree that we will do what we can to make it a success? And if there's a valid reason why it's not working, we'll all agree that we stop there and we move on to the next thing. So it's much more around breaking organizational silos, organizational barriers, and trying to work together. And I found that working with 7 or 8 colleagues like that, rather than going up the hierarchy and then coming back down, was much more efficient, but also much more fun. And then very quickly over the next few minutes, I'll give you a few examples of open innovation working. So this was Bosch. They invested several £million in London. They created a test bed, which was sat with, where they were accepting TfL's problem statements. They're doing this with other cities across the world. And the idea there is that not only was it their R&D experts, they'd bring the whole ecosystem of innovators. So here you'd have 50, 60 different companies all sat together addressing London's transport challenges, but other city challenges too. And the atmosphere that was created there was, incredible. I mean, I used to quite enjoy going in there because sometimes when you're at your head office, everyone behaves in the same way, whereas here it was quite a creative and a diversity of thought sort of approach to problem solving. I've touched on the market engagements of Scout wide, Scout far, be open, work with your comms teams, work with your procurement teams. If people don't know about your challenges, they can't respond to them. And if you put them on a pin thing, and I call it a thing, only certain people will know about it. And that will be your tier one suppliers. So surprise, surprise, you'll get the same old responses to your challenges. Touched on open data. This was interesting. Bosch invested a state-of-the-art sensor in Brixton. So if anyone from Lambeth is here, thank you for allowing us to do this. And this was the hypothesis that if you held traffic back from a densely populated area and it smoothly flowed through a densely populated area, so sorry, you hold traffic back in a less densely populated area and it smoothly flows through a densely populated area, what impact is it having to the air that you're breathing in? And quite often air quality sensors are really high, or they're in different parts of the borough. But also there's so much variables involved when it comes to measuring the air quality that you're breathing in. It could be the types of vehicles that are going by, it could be the typology of the buildings, it could be the weather. So Bosch created a state-of-the-art sensor, which they installed in London for free, but they also created a new model with their best transport modelers. And by ingesting all that different types of data, they told us that exposure to bad air by holding traffic back was reducing exposure by 20%. And as a result, TfO then made those signal changes at 1,200 signals across London over a year on the TLRN. So a great example of TfO did not spend a penny. Bosch created a new product, which now they're selling across the world. And London's benefiting as a result of it. Also, this is one around computer vision and deep learning. It's really hard sometimes to identify a cyclist or a car or a powered two-wheeler, or particularly at night. So what we tried to do here is segment the road from unsafe, which is the red part, to safe, which is the bit in the middle, which was green, and then the blue's the sort of semi-safe or semi-unsafe. And then what was tried is how are people behaving at a given time on a particular junction. And what this allowed us to do is test different interventions before an incident took place. So it's much more about predictive analysis. But also what it allowed us to do is think about a CCTV strategy in London and what standards do we need to work to. And what we definitely realized is deep learning when it comes to computer vision is not easy, but it allowed us to create some new standards. Also, we've worked with Mercedes. Again, they're working with cities across the world now. An average car has 100 sensors. So imagine a snowy day, a gritty, where you want to grit the road network across your borough. There'll be different parts of the borough, certainly across London, where the roadside temperature is lower than at the other place. So it allows you to prioritize based on the wheel sensor in the Mercedes. But secondly, and more relevant, is it allows us to know, are people driving disproportionately in terms of acceleration, skidding, swerving, and other abnormal behavior? And if they are, and you're starting to build a pattern, well, there's a road safety risk there. So as a result, how can we improve our road risk prediction model rather than just simply responding to tragedies and serious injuries, we're actually responding to behavior types and near misses. So a very different model. And we're also now working in cities across the world, are now working with companies like C-Sense, who do the same with cycling data, but also with buses and freight. So building a brand new risk profile based on advances in cloud, advances in data science, and as a result, you can create new value and assess where your investment goes in road safety. We also brought startups in. So this was about the adverse impact of roadworks, and I think we worked with London councils on this and perhaps some boroughs as well. And the idea here was, how do you reduce the adverse impact of roadworks, but you don't want the same old solutions? So we got 9 different solutions, which we tested over 10 weeks in London. And that ranged from anything from scanning the road network for water leak detection to new types of barriers. So if the barrier's fallen over on a windy day, someone's notified and you can get the barrier back up. Different types of sensors in vehicles, which tells you about road conditioning and road condition monitoring. But the two that we took forward one was SAM, which was scanning social media, and based on that social media, based on event types, keywords, key pictures, it was able to tell us where there might be a water leak, where there might be a particular incident, and we were able to respond that through our control center and work with the relevant boroughs or TfL's operational staff to respond more effectively. And the second one was working with the utilities companies. We were able to model roadworks before they took place to assess what impact it could have on road safety, on congestion, on air quality before the roadworks took place. So again, it's much more of a productive focus. My point here being is you can work with innovators, you can bring them in. It was a multi-million-pound contract, so it creates a level playing field. But the point here is there's a process to follow, and procurement's critical. We applied an innovative partnerships procedure, one of the first in Europe to do this, to really find a way of defining problems, experimenting, trialing, pivoting, developing a business case, and then ultimately contract managing or scaling and contract managing. There are lots of other trials that we're also involved with and other cities are involved with. And of course, we've been working with some of you on the scooter trial, where it's quite data-led. It's a new form of transport. How do we as cities manage these new forms of transport? We can't just, as I say yes to everything and deal with the consequences, but nor should we be saying no if we think there's something there. So how do you run trials? How do you manage those trials? And then how do you create data as evidence to ultimately influence policy? And also, innovation doesn't always have to come from the core parts of the organization or the perceived core parts. Just think about a lamppost. A lamppost has been the same for the past 150 years, except some variations of the material. But over the next 10 years, I strongly believe that a lamppost could be an air quality sensor. It could be an EV charge point, which it already is. But more relevant is it could start talking to buses and cars. As you have connected vehicles, they'll want to talk to connected infrastructure. So rather than constantly reprocuring, how do we design contracts and schedules which allows you to be more modular, and as a result, not only experiment, but do it at a much cheaper cost in terms of total cost of ownership? And it's not just transport, it could be housing, it could be a touch on EVs, repurposing car parks, working with Sook. We reframed how we think about retail in terms of the sites that TfL owns. So it can be applied with whatever you're doing. It doesn't have to just be transport. And I won't touch too much on this, but this is an open innovation canvas. So this was how we strategically thought about open innovation. And I will pause there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rakesh. Really, really fantastic and really great examples there. Just open it to participants now in case they have any questions. Don't be shy. Raise your hand or put your question in the chat. Matthew. Oh, we've got two hands. Hold on. Yeah, I think it's now.
Yeah. Everyone stands waiting for them and then they all come along. Rakesh, thanks very much. That was really, really interesting. And actually, it's made me start to think a little wider about some of the things that are sort of going on in the borough that I'm working with at the moment. It's more of an observation than anything else. It's just really interested to see the point you made about what is the point in time when something is good enough when you're going through that design phase, rather than trying to achieve 100% all the time. We keep talking about our MVP now because we like a snappy acronym in IT, don't we? So it's all
Yes.
about the minimum viable product, but it's just trying to find that sweet spot, isn't it? About when is good enough, and how much time and effort do you spend on something before actually you're in essence you're wasting time and effort.
Yeah, it's a great point, Matthew, and I think that last point you made in particular is really relevant, because we could have spent 80% of the time to get it to 80%, and then 20% of the time to get to 80%, and then we end up spending 80% of the time to get to the last 20, and it just gets frustrating for everyone. And I think every organization is different, and you've got to set the rules of what is good enough in your organization, and who are the people around the table, the advocates that you have, that can give you that stamp of authority or the approval. Because I think the risk is that if you take it to everyone, and we do this quite a lot in local government, is we try and get it signed off by everyone. And then we go to some sort of governance thing, and then in the governance piece, someone says, you know what, we love it, but could we now go offline and have another 6-month conversation with someone? And I think my advice would be start with 1 or 2, and with the right guardrails, but then move. It doesn't have to move from 1 to 2 to 1,000. It could move from 1 to 2 to 10. And if that's successful, what does the next phase look like, which could be 20 or 50? And how do you start building, getting to that tipping point where it's working? Because otherwise, sometimes people want to prove it once, and then they want to get it past the MVP. They want to scale it to 1,000, and it might be too much of a leap for the organization. So every organization is different. Do it in an iterative manner in terms of scaling, rather than 1 to 1,000, and find the right advocates around you, and do that before you go to any cabinet meeting or any other session, because the worst thing is you go into a cabinet meeting, everyone likes it, but they still say, not sure, can you come back in a year's time?
Absolutely. Great. Thank you.
My turn?
Yes, please.
Hi there. Hi. Thanks for that, Rakesh. That was really good. Really interesting, some of the work. I think we're all keen, chomping at the bit to sort of get innovation going, get the grey matter running, and people on the ground at the coalface come up with some really good ideas. And I know the model you displayed was get the people on board who really come up with some of these creative ideas and create some proofs of concept. And I think the challenge at the moment in this current economic climate, and I think it's just not easing up for a lot of local authorities, is how do you justify that spend versus that innovation? And I know you touched a little bit on that, but I mean, if you could just sort of talk about the sell to the senior leadership teams, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. Is it Memuna?
Memuna, yes, thank you.
Memuna, thank you. Thanks, Memuna. And when I first started in my roles, I was around TfL for a while, but when I set this open innovation function up, it was me and half a graduate. And it was even half a graduate. They didn't even give me a full graduate. And the question that my boss asked me at the time is, Rakesh, do you want to set up a team that sits outside of the organization that comes back every so often with ideas, or do you want a different model? And we went with a different model because I wanted to bring people in on secondments. Because by bringing people in on secondments, there's more ownership, and they've got a greater relationship with the service owner. So what we started with was that model that we will start scaling based on people's needs, and they give us resource for them. And some of the first few that we started with were actually not cool, shiny products. They were quite boring products. You know, like people said, do you want to focus on the future of micromobility, the future of connected autonomous vehicles, all these really interesting products that Google and others were invested in. But we started with roadworks. I mean, it might be exciting for some anyway, but I thought it was interesting. But we started with roadworks because roadworks was costing us so much money in London, and a service owner for roads said, I'm desperate to solve some of these challenges. So immediately he gave us a load of resource and some budget. And we said we only focused on things that kept him awake at night. We said, if it's stuff that you already can do and you want to do it your way, then do it. But where we're interested in is where you're actually absolutely stuck and you're getting kicked from different stakeholders. So that's how we started. And then in terms of the ROI, by the end, my boss said to me that every £1 that we invest in your team or the department, we want £5 back. So the idea there was that there'll be loads of stuff that just went wrong, frankly. You know, we killed it at the MVP stage. But those 5 or 6 things that was adding value was arguably worth millions. And that paid for my team and the function itself. So that takes time to build up. So my advice would be start with some quick wins that you know you could do well in. And then over time, start spreading your bets a bit differently, you know, going for the long-term bets or applying some safe bets.
Brilliant. No, that's really good, actually. Yeah. That is a really good way to do it as well. And I think I might steal some of those ideas if that's okay, Rakesh.
Go for it. No problem at all.
Brilliant.
Problem at all.
Thank you.
And I'm around, so give me a shout. Gent has my details. So
fantastic.
Yes, we'll share those at the end as well. I think because you've got another follow-up question from Matthew regarding pushback from management board. I think that means yeah, when you're looking at getting the sensor data shared to be able to use.
Yeah. So Matthew, good question. So we're fortunate we're working with a German company, and German companies are even stricter than the UK when it comes to GDPR. So it's Mercedes-Benz, yeah. So they're based in Stuttgart, and our principle was always anonymous, aggregated. We had lots of questions around, will you be able to identify anyone? We made sure we put the right rules in place. We also had lots of questions about Mercedes are only owned by lots of rich people that only travel in rich areas, which wasn't the case. We got Mercedes, on average, there's 2 Mercedes every kilometre across London. So we got a good representation of sample size. But yeah, from a privacy point of view, very careful. And I think there's some new laws changing now across Europe, where Mercedes are going to have quite a task now, because I think they have to get individual permission before they use any data, whether it's aggregated or not. So that's their challenge now. But for us, we're very careful, very sensitive.
And did you approach any other manufacturers, or was it just focused on MB?
Yeah, we worked with Ford. So we did do some work with Ford and the mobility in London. And after a while, we started to build a picture that whether it's Ford, Jaguar, Toyota, as long as they've got a decent sample size, we don't need to get data from everyone, because one, 2 cars every kilometre is a decent representation, because it's going up and down all the time.
So have you carried on with that data collection and aggregation and sort of, pumping it in to give you intelligence, because we talk a lot about data in London, and when you sort of go to some of the events, Theo is really passionate about how we can have open data across London, how we encourage people to share data. And we're all doing our own individual stuff still, and that still kind of confuses me why we're not sort of linking up and sharing all the time, because it just makes sense. But in terms of things that could actually give you, we're talking in Merton. One of our strategic aims as an organisation is to be, a borough of sport, and that's primarily designed to increase fitness and health, and promote people into health-related activities, to try and lower, the impact on services and adult social care, etc., etc. So, but it's being badged in a different way to try and sort of make it interesting. But when I'm talking to the leader, I'm talking about, this view of how we could aggregate data so that people can make informed choices. So I don't know, they want to cycle today and they want to go to a park. How busy is the park? Where's the nearest bike? What's the air quality like? Is that cycling route available? What's the traffic like? And just being able to sort of consume that as a snapshot of information to make an instant decision like that, rather than having to trawl through lots of different websites and download different apps, just finding that single lens to inform people. And it's sort of stuff like that would really feed into that aggregated data model.
Yeah, and I think your vision is a really powerful one. And this is where our customers, our citizens, there's 9 million residents in London, they cross boundaries all the time. And whilst we recognise our own boundaries for good reasons, customers don't. Through Enfield, we'll have the TLRN going through there, and customers don't notice the difference. They just see a different road. And I think what we need to do is get much better at defining what good looks like. Find 3 or 4 common things, because we won't agree on everything. But what are those 3 or 4 common things? And then think about what data is already available openly. What new data do we need to create? What does that user persona look like? And then how do we make their life better? Because you're right. If I knew if air quality on this side of my road was better than the other side, why aren't I walking on the other side of the road? Because it's making me healthier. And if I've not got that data, well, then I'm losing out, and actually I'm getting more ill.
Mm-hmm. And equally, so there's the resident and the citizen focus, but there's also then the council focus with that duty of care to make sure the resident experience is great and they're looking after the residents, etc. So if we're seeing higher levels of pollution, how can we use that intelligence to address our transport policies, for argument's sake, and how we route vehicles through? And it's kind of a little bit mind-blowing when you think of some of the applications of these things, but we're all headed in that direction, surely.
And this is where, whether it's with Theo or someone else, we need to define those data standards up front so it's interoperable. We need to get the basics right. And once we've got the basics right, as we're creating new data, then we need to think about how do we work together? So how do we share data internally within Enfield? How do we share data with my neighbouring boroughs near Enfield? So that could be, I don't know, is it Hackney? No, not Hackney. I'm trying to figure out who's near you. But anyway, Haringey and the other boroughs.
So I'm in Merton.
You're
my
Merton,
surname
sorry.
is
Okay.
Enfield.
Sorry, that's your surname. Sorry. So if it's near Merton, if it's Croydon and the other boroughs, what data are we sharing locally with the other boroughs? And then moving forward from there, how do we start sharing that data across London with other boroughs? And then how do we share that data with the market? And that's what we need to sort of take ownership of, because otherwise we'll all be spitting out loads of data, creating loads of data, and then we find that none of it's interoperable. And then you have to get a big tier 4 agency to spend lots of money on.
Cool, thank you for that.
Okay.
Any other questions? Rikesh, I have a question for you. So we've got lots of borough officers on the call. I wondered if you have, or what advice do you have for, for boroughs who are wanting to be more innovative, to make, as you said, a mixture of different bets, safe bets, but also kind of some more kind of experimental types of steps. What advice do you have for them as they navigate their internal governance processes?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the first one is don't be afraid, right? We're in a very hierarchical culture in the public sector, and we worry about what everyone above us says, what you can and can't do. But frankly, their answer will quite often be based on their biases. So I think don't always, be prepared to be curious, be prepared to be challenged, but do it diplomatically. And just the design thinking process by itself is fundamental to an organization where you're just asking questions that are different. So the amount of times where I've been involved, or my team's been involved, where we don't do the full end-to-end innovation process. We only do the first bit, which is the design thinking bit, and that's really provoked lots of debate, lots of thought. So I think that's one. So you don't have to do the full end-to-end. I think two, find problems that are really knotty and people that are genuinely stuck in, because they will need your capacity and your capability to help think about this differently. But three, think about, what does innovation mean for your organization? How do you define it? Is it something that the tech and engineering people own? Is it a process thing? Is it a people thing? Is it a product thing? Start framing what you mean by innovation. And you don't even have to use the word innovation. I did my best not to use the word innovation. I tried to use the words of creating new value. And by creating new value, no one can argue with you. If you're trying to create new value for your business, if you're trying to bring innovation in, they might argue with you. So how do you create new value for your business and bring that diversity of thought, but focus on the areas where it's most needed? It could be internal processes, or it could be something that's from the market.
Thanks for that. That's a really good point around, tech is part of the solution, but it's not the silver bullet that we often tend to think of. Great. Last call for question. Oh, we've got another hand. Joseph.
Hi there. Thanks, Rakesh. It's really helpful. Lots of good information there. I've got a question about partnership working. So where we have a joint goal, let's say, across London, and we're thinking about working with our partners, our surrounding boroughs. Can you give some sort of examples, maybe, where you've been able to sort of crack a nut, which has been like, okay, we need partnership working, we need to be aligned with our, let's call it, sub-regional boroughs to achieve a common goal? Have you found ways you can sort of explain a bit about, in terms of how you can, I wouldn't say just accelerate that process, but be able to tap into what those common goals are and how you push that through collectively with your partner boroughs in an efficient way? Because we know we've all got our different goals, we've all got, our limitations around budgets and etc. But what have you sort of found as in sort of useful solutions to partner with boroughs and to be able to move at pace with one another to achieve common goals?
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. I think a couple of things. I think the first one is we've got to pick a theme or a problem that we're trying to solve that all of those boroughs are up for solving. So if you're picking something that's too political, we know it's going to get stuck with the councillors and it'll probably close down. So I think pick a topic that people can't argue on, and that could be anything. It could be anything. No one's going to argue with road safety or crime. If they're the particular problem areas, how do we keep people safe? How do we keep people more secure? That's a problem statement that I can't imagine anyone arguing with. But so that's the first point. Pick a theme that's relevant. 2, engage with the right people, because it's a people business. So engage with the person on the other borough who's got a similar sort of value sets to you. Don't worry about the political affiliation, but have they got a similar value set to you, which is you want to experiment, you want to try, and you want to scale, because they can do some incredible things on their side to unblock. And suddenly you might create that coalition of the willing with 3 or 4 boroughs, because others will be the same. And it's powerful how that can work. So that's my second point. And I think some of the challenges that are faced at TFO, we launched Google Street View, and that was Google Street View within stations. So we're to work with the police, we're to work with the security agencies, we're to work with commercial people, multiple stakeholders, maybe even boroughs, I can't remember. But it came back to, let's run some trials, let's prove the art of the possible, and then let's showcase the evidence that we've done through the trials, and then let's try and convince people, because initially people thought when we did the Street View that it will turn into a counter-terrorism risk, where people will do lots of surveying beforehand. So we said, all right, how far can we go? We'll only do the public areas and nothing else. And we'll make sure when we do those public areas, we'll give an impression that it's a controlled environment by showing uniformed staff and police officers. So what's that sweet spot that you can find for things to work? Because ultimately, I think what I found with innovation, and particularly the partnership sides, it's about doing deals. You're trying to win hearts and minds, you're trying to negotiate, and you're trying to do a deal. And then if you get that right, you get the right product anyway, because then you work together on the product side. But if you can't do the right deal up front or during, someone will find a reason to destroy it. You want to be on the same page.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Last few minutes for any last questions or thoughts.
Actually, and the other point is bring Lottie in. I forgot to mention again. So I think Lottie's purpose is exactly this: is how can we work with 4 or 5 boroughs, or all the boroughs, to solve problems in a joint manner? And the capability they have on their side is fantastic. Some of the things I've described today, whether it's the challenges they focus on homelessness, but lots of other areas, they've got a good set of people, and use them.
Thank you for that shout out, Rikesh. Really appreciate it. Just to say, I think if there are no more questions, we will say thank you to Rikesh for that brilliant presentations and the case studies. Thank you to all of you for the really good questions and the discussion. We will share Rikesh's contact details, as well as the slides and the recording afterwards. And if you have any questions, you've got my email. So please do reach out, and have a good rest of the day. Thanks all.